NBA trades get offered and rejected all the time. There's hundreds of trades we rarely hear about because they just didn't happen. But it's very interesting to find out that many of them would have created some of the most dominant super teams of all time. And these deals actually almost went through, but for one reason or another were turned down at the last minute. So I'm here to show you the 11 super teams we just barely missed out on. Like back in 2017, Kyrie Irving very publicly requested a trade from the championship contending Cavaliers, and it spun off into a lot of potential trades and super teams that were almost formed. Well, in the 2017 offseason, originally both Carmelo Anthony and Paul George left their teams for the OKC Thunder. But before that happened, there was a deal in place to send both of them to the Cleveland Cavaliers during the NBA draft. And even Carmelo has come out and said that all teams had actually agreed on the deal, and it was about to go through, but Pacers GM pulled out at the last minute. And had he not, we would have seen a super team of Carmelo Anthony, Paul George, and LeBron James. But the interesting thing about this one is that the trade would have went down an entire month before Kyrie Irving publicly requested a trade. So if that would have made him choose to stay, we could have been seeing this big four, which would have been one of the most dominant in NBA history. I really don't know how the Cavs were going to make this deal work because they didn't have very many trade assets, but according to Melo, it almost happened. But since it didn't, Anthony and PG stayed connected and both ended up joining OKC together. I was always against super teams forming, but in this case, it would have actually been great because it would have given someone an actual chance to beat the Golden State Warriors. And seeing that finals matchup would have been insane. Okay, but since that didn't happen, after Kyrie Irving demanded a trade, the Cavs ended up sending him to the Celtics. But things almost went very differently there because the Bucks had offered a deal of Malcolm Brogdon, Chris Middleton, and a first-round pick for Kyrie that the Cavs said no to. And of course, this isn't the best deal, but it still would have been much better than what they actually ended up getting. But it also makes sense why they turned it down. At the time, Brogdon was a rookie averaging 10 and 4, and Chris Middleton was averaging 14 points a game. They didn't have time to wait for these guys to develop into the 20-point per game guys that they became. Had it have gone through though, we would have gotten to see a duo of Giannis and Kyrie Irving. And for these guys to have gotten to play the pick and roll together, they arguably would have been the best duo in the league and may have won the title a bit sooner than they did. And to imagine the team that would have been built around these guys, the Bucks definitely would have been a super team. But then again, we are talking about Kyrie Irving, so long-term Milwaukee has to be glad they didn't do this trade. Plus, they ended up getting their title anyways, so everything worked out for them. But speaking of Kyrie, we have one last super team that almost happened revolving around him. So back in 2009, Blake Griffin was drafted first overall to the Clippers. Well, at the beginning of that next season, the team traded that year's first-round pick and Baron Davis to the Cavs for Mo Williams. And unfortunately for them, that first-round pick turned out to be first overall. So the Cavs got to draft Kyrie Irving that offseason. Had the Clippers not made that terrible deal though, they would have been able to draft Kyrie to team him up with Blake Griffin. And if that was the case, they would have never needed to trade for Chris Paul just a couple of weeks later. So instead, they could have tried to make a deal for another superstar with guys like Carmelo Anthony and Dwight Howard on the trade market that year. And even if not, those Clippers teams with Kyrie instead of CP3, maybe they would have had more success. It's not that crazy to imagine seeing that one of them usually failed to live up to expectations during the playoffs thanks to injuries, and one couldn't have played any better when the postseason came around. So who knows, maybe Kyrie Irving could have been the guy that got the Clippers over that last hump that they never were able to. Now, the next NBA super team that was almost formed is gonna be hard to process that it actually almost happened. But according to Hakeem Olajuwon, he's come out and said that himself, Michael Jordan, and Clyde Drexler all almost wound up on the same roster. You see, in the 1984 NBA draft, the Rockets had the first pick, which they used to draft Hakeem Olajuwon, and he was set to team up with their 7'4" center Ralph Sampson. But Portland was looking for a big man, and they were willing to trade their second overall pick that year and Clyde Drexler to Houston for Ralph. But the Rockets said no. Had they have accepted it though, they could have had Hakeem and Clyde on the same team, then used that second overall pick to draft Michael Jordan, giving them the most dominant big three the game would have ever seen. I mean, look at how things turned out in 1995. Drexler and Hakeem did end up playing together that year, and it won them an NBA championship. Then, you know, just casually add the greatest of all time to that mix. I mean, already either Michael Jordan or Hakeem won every single championship from 1991 to 1998. So if they would have played together, it would have been a similar effect to Bill Russell's dominance in the 60s. I'm just glad this didn't go through, or the Trailblazers would have got cloudy even more than they already do for terrible draft day decisions. But speaking of bad draft day decisions, in 2003, the Detroit Pistons drafted Darko Milicic second overall over Carmelo Anthony, Chris Bosh, and Dwayne Wade. And that very next year, the Pistons won the NBA championship against the Lakers for having one of the best defensive teams of all time. But that's where things are just crazy. The Pistons were known for their defense, as well as being maybe the only team in NBA history to have won a title without a true superstar on the team. I mean, their offense was really limited. No one on the roster even averaged 20 points a game, and only 4 players put up double digits. So just imagine if this squad would have added a rookie Carmelo Anthony and given him an unlimited amount of offense. He could have averaged 30 a game as a rookie. But not even dealing in some what ifs, just look at the stats that actually happened. Melo got to the Denver Nuggets and put up 21 points a game, which would have led the Pistons in scoring as it was. And everything would have changed in NBA history. Melo would have actually gotten a ring and done it as a rookie. The Pistons probably run it back again the next year against the Spurs, and who knows what happens after that. All I know is I wish I could have seen this super team come to light. Another very interesting super team that's almost hard to believe actually went down took place in 2007 for the Dallas Mavericks. You see, in 2007, Kobe Bryant was still on the Lakers, and the team had been pretty terrible ever since Shaq left a few years prior. So infamously, Kobe was very closely almost traded to multiple different NBA teams. One of them happened to be the Dallas Mavericks. And in an interview with Fair Game, Mark Cuban talks about how he almost traded Josh Howard, Jason Terry, and a first-round pick for Kobe Bryant, and the trade was about to go down until Jerry Buss had one last talk with Kobe and talked him out of it. But the interesting part comes next, because about a minute later in the interview, he's asked if he ever tried to trade for Shaq and mentions how he had an agreement where the Miami Heat would buy out his contract and then he would sign with the Mavs that year, which just so happened to be in 2007. Could you just imagine if Kobe and Shaq reunited on the Mavs to team up with Dirk Nowitzki? I think most NBA fans' minds would explode. 2007 was a huge year for Kobe though, because not only was he almost a part of that super team, but that year the Lakers almost brought in Kevin Garnett, which would have been insane for so many reasons. The duo of Pau Gasol and Kobe would have been replaced with KG in his spot. Apparently Phil Jackson had a handshake agreement with the Wolves owner at the time to send Lamar Odom and Andrew Bynum to Minnesota in exchange for KG, which would have totally disrupted NBA history as we know it, because the next 3 titles that year were won by KG and the Celtics and Kobe and the Lakers. So had this trade gone down, it probably would have been LA with all 3 and another 3-peat, which would have given Garnett 3 titles instead of 1, and Kobe 2 3-peats exactly like Michael Jordan. But Garnett said he had say in where he got traded, and he didn't want to go and be involved with Kobe and Phil Jackson's toxic relationship, so the Wolves traded him to Boston instead. So I bet there's gotta be some regret on that one. Now we've brought up Kobe quite a few times already, but I have one more super team surrounding him that needs to be mentioned, and on paper this one looks great. In reality, maybe not so much though. You see, in 1995, Magic Johnson returned to the NBA after 4 years away, but he decided to go back into retirement at the end of that season. The very next year, LA wasted no time and drafted Kobe Bryant and brought in Shaq. So it's just weird to think about that had Magic stayed for just one more season in the league, for one season there would have been a super team of Magic Johnson, Kobe Bryant, and Shaq. And even if Magic had stayed longer, the Lakers most likely would have still brought in both of these guys, so it's not even like that wouldn't have happened. They still would have had that draft pick, and Shaq still would have needed a home in free agency. The only reason I say in reality this wouldn't have been a great team though, is because, well, it wouldn't have. Magic retired for the second time because he wasn't nearly as good anymore, and Kobe only got to play 15 minutes a game in his rookie season. So it's not like this would have been a dominant team or anything. Looking back though, it would have been great to see. Now speaking of Kobe and Shaq teaming up with NBA legends, this next Lakers super team would have actually made a huge impact on NBA history. You see, in 1998, the Bulls broke up after their second three-peat, so Scottie Pippen goes to the Houston Rockets. He was supposed to be forming a super team there with Charles Barkley and Hakeem Olajuwon, but he was never a good fit, so at the end of that year, Houston trades him again, and this is where things get interesting. He ends up on the Blazers, who were rumored to try and flip him to the LA Lakers. So LA was going to send Glenn Rice, Robert Horry, and Travis Knight to Portland in order to bring in a still only 33-year-old Scottie Pippen, but the team ultimately decided against it. Can you imagine this though? This was all during the Lakers season that would start their three-peat. How mind-blowing would it be for Scottie Pippen to go from three-peating with Michael Jordan and Phil Jackson to three-peating with Kobe Bryant and Phil Jackson? His defense at this age still would have been a force to be reckoned with in that Lakers system, and to think of Scottie as a 9-time NBA champion would have just been wild. All the stars would have perfectly aligned in his NBA career had this happened, but instead now it's just another what if. We just briefly mentioned the Chicago Bulls, and they come up in another major almost super team. Originally back in 2010, Dwayne Wade re-signed with the Miami Heat, and Chris Bosh and LeBron James joined him there. But Wade and James were actually very close to signing with the Chicago Bulls instead. If Chris Bosh hadn't signed with the Heat, then their plan was to go join Derrick Rose, Joakim Noah, Luol Deng, Taj Gibson, and that defensive heavy Bulls team. And if both guys had signed there, they may have gotten even more hate than Kevin Durant did joining the Warriors. To be fair though, these guys in Chicago didn't really officially turn into a powerhouse until 1 year later. It wasn't until the season after LeBron's decision that everyone stepped up. Rose won MVP, Noah became a defensive powerhouse, and the whole team came together. Had this happened though, they would have been a great super team, but D-Rose still gets injured eventually, so it wouldn't have lasted very long at all. A super team that we actually had that didn't last long at all either was that of the Orlando Magic, because this one only lasted a matter of minutes. Back in 1993, the Magic just had Shaq, who came in off his rookie rookie season. And they also had the first overall pick in that year's draft, which they used to pick Chris Webber. If the duo of Webber and Shaq had stayed together, they would have been one of the most dominant big man duos of all time. With Webber's ability to stretch the floor to go along with Shaq's dominance down low, they may have been able to make some real noise. But instead, Chris was drafted, then traded on draft night as a part of the deal that brought in Penny Hardaway, which, as we know, kinda turned out terribly. But speaking of what would have been a dominant duo, let's move over to the Toronto Raptors. Back in 2001, the Mavericks wanted to bring in a star, so they actually offered a young Dirk Nowitzki and Steve Nash for Vince Carter and Antonio Davis. And there's so much to unpack here. At the time, Dallas's duo was still unproven, and the Raptors actually turned this one down because they didn't see enough potential in Dirk Nowitzki and Steve Nash, which is hilarious looking back, especially when seeing how the whole Vince Carter scenario played out in Toronto. Had Steve and Dirk been traded together in this deal though, it's very likely that they would have stayed together much longer. I mean, Dirk was loyal to whatever team he was on, and Steve would have been playing for his home country. So forget the Raptors, just imagine how great it would have been to see these two guys playing together for years. If you enjoyed, like, comment, subscribe, and I'm out.